Hi, everybody. I think Steve has already done all of his instructions on what we're doing here today. So I'm just introducing to you a very special guest we have with us today, Mr. Mike Kaplan. And just so you know a little bit about him, Mike is an entrepreneur with over 25 years of business experience. And he's built 3 multi-million-dollar sales companies and has a broad range of skills and experience in sales, marketing, management, and finance. Now, he's helped countless number of business owners to discover how to increase the efficiency of their sales process and boost revenue. He's the author of the bestseller book called Secrets of a Master Closer, which is his proprietary sales training system that he used to train thousands of salespeople to be professional closers, as well as to grow one of his own sales businesses into an Inc. 500 fastest growing business winner. Okay, so he is here with us today to share with you from his book his 8-step roadmap to unlimited sales. So I'm going to turn it over to Mike, and you all can just give him a virtual hand. Here he is.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for taking time out of your busy day to spend with me to talk about the subject of sales. First of all, I want to thank Kathy and Steve and Sean over at Accelerated Training Solutions for inviting me over. As a little plug for them, I would highly suggest that you tune in every Thursday at 2 o'clock for their different webinars. Kind of feed your mind with these gems that they have and just keep you propelling through the week. So as Kathy mentioned, I recently published a book on sales. It's called Secrets of a Master Closer. In the time I have, I'm going to be able to give you an overview of the sales and my book, but by the end, I will tell you exactly how you can get all the information, but this is just going to be an overview. So to start, I know it sounds like I'm preaching to the choir, but sales in general and salespeople in particular are vital to nearly every business. I consider sales a bridge from marketing to prospects to creating clients. Sales is kind of like the anchor leg of the relay race, and I know we've all watched the Olympics, or a lot of you watch the Olympics, and you know what I'm talking about. You don't win until that anchor leg comes through and crosses the finish line. And if some of you are lucky enough in your business to generate all the clients you need just from marketing, and you don't need a salesperson to help carry it across, well then, you know, you're fortunate. But from most of the business people that I've talked to, they need an active involvement of a sales team or a salesperson to actually convert those prospects that have shown some interest from their marketing and convert them to actual customers. Now, I know there are some people that I'm probably talking to now that might be new to sales, and some are seasoned veterans. As a kind of a little note or a warning before I get started, I don't want anyone to change what they're currently doing that is successful. But I ask that you kind of clear your mind for the next 15 or 20 minutes while I share a brief overview of how I approach sales. But before we get started, first let me give you a little bit of a background of my sales history. Many years ago in a business far, far away, I walked in and asked for a sales job because I had dropped out of college and I really had no real marketable skills, and somebody told me sales is the place you ought to be. And I said, all right. So I went in for the interview, and the interview was actually kind of an audition where they handed me a script and said, get on the phone and read this sales script, call a real live prospect. Now, I had never done that before. I really I didn't hold salespeople in high regard. I only thought of them as car salespeople and people trying to get my money or trying to convince me to do something I didn't want to do. So I already kind of went in with kind of a tainted attitude, but I said, you know, I need a job. I want to make money. Let's give it a shot. So I read through the script. It was about a minute sales call. I got to the end of the script, and I had no idea what I was saying. I was just reading the words on the paper. I had no idea what the responses were from the prospect, really. I just kept going, and I hung up. And the guy looked at me, the guy interviewing me, and he said, you're hired. And I went, really? All right. So let's give this a shot. So my sales training consisted of, here's a script. Here's some information about the product, the features. Here are 3 or 4 major objections, and this is how we answer them. Go get started. And that was my sales training. And needless to say, it was a little rough and difficult at the beginning, trying to navigate my way through what the heck am I supposed to be doing here as far as sales are concerned. So quickly, I looked over to the people sitting next to me in the sales room, and I spotted the guys that were really doing the job correctly. And my first thought was, well, I'm just going to copy what they're doing. I'm going to observe and steal whatever they're doing that works, and that's how I'm going to build up my sales bag of tools. So that worked to a certain degree. I was memorizing gimmicks, and if the prospect says this, I should say that. If this objection comes up, this is how I should handle it. Maybe this is a good way to open up the sale. And what was happening is I was collecting this bag of tricks, or just if you imagine a mental shelf where I was placing all these different techniques that I was memorizing. And I was memorizing them without really any real fundamental understanding underneath of why they worked, if in fact they did work. But that's how I got started, and I started doing pretty well, but not great. But it was my first step in realizing that, maybe there's more to this than just memorizing a bunch of gimmicks. So I was fortunate at the time to run across a lecture series on sales by the godfather of sales training, a guy named J. Douglas Edwards. You should make note of that guy's name. You can Google him. It's J. Douglas Edwards. His series of tapes, they were actually recorded back in the 60s for insurance people. He was one of the first sales trainers to ever exist. In fact, a lot of his training knowledge was the foundation for other sales trainers that came after him. So anyway, I was lucky enough to get a set of those tapes. By the way, the tapes are called, I believe now, Back to the Future in Sales. You can Google that. Anyway, so I had the tapes, and after work every day, I'd go home and I'd spend a half an hour listening to the lectures, writing down what I thought were really neat ideas and some more gimmicks and some approaches, and I would write them down and I'd recraft them into some wording that applied to what I was selling at the time. I'd work out all the wording, and the next day I'd go to work and I'd put these cards on my desk with these different techniques, and I would test each one. And my rule of thumb was I'll try it 3 times. If it doesn't work in 3 times, I toss the technique out as being no good. If I happen to get a result with it, I continue to use it. So I did that for about 6 months, and my mental shelf of all my knowledge about sales just kept stacking up and getting really full. And while I was doing that, my sales continued to increase because I was learning more techniques. However, I was still suffering from not totally understanding what sales was all about. What was the fundamental understanding of sales? I was still looking at it as an art versus a science. And I started thinking, there's got to be something missing, something I need to look at here to be able to see if I can move sales over from being an art to more of a science. So that was that question, that point there got me to look at something for the first time. And I said, well, what do I do? Let's start from the very, very beginning. And I started with, well, what is the definition of selling? And I know a lot of you probably already have your definition, but I wanted to find a definition that not only explained what selling was, but actually guided me and directed me in a direction where I could develop a sales system that worked for me. I wanted kind of an action definition that not only showed the purpose of selling, but kind of opened the door to a solution of what selling really is. And here's my definition. Selling is the process of persuading someone to buy your product, service, or idea. Now, obviously, most of us already know that persuading or convincing someone to buy something that you're selling is what selling is all about. And your ability to persuade or convince somebody is going to determine how successful you are in sales. But there's a word there that I highlighted in the definition, and that's the word process. That was the key that opened up the door. Let's look at that definition. says process is an organized series of actions directed to some end. When I really understood the definition of process, then all of a sudden the definition of selling became very clear to me. And I wanted this definition to be able to align everything else that I was going to be exposed to in any sales training or sales books or lectures I was going to read from that point on. So let's take a look at this. Process is an organized series of actions directed to some end. Well, organized means it's systemized, it's organized, and a series is, you know, a sequential steps of something directed toward an end. So when you really look at that and you go, wait a minute, selling isn't just getting on the phone and just kind of figuring out what to do while you're in the middle of a sale. Not just, hey, I'm going to present everything I know about my product, every feature, and hope at the end that the guy or the girl is ready to buy. It's an organized series of actions. So once I really embraced that, I said, wow, there is an actual series of steps, a method to selling. It isn't just a bunch of things I'm pulling off the shelf as I need them. So the next step was, how do I figure out what is the organized series of actions? Well, what I did was I used a technique called reverse engineering. And reverse engineering is when you take a product and you break it down, a final product or something that's built, something that exists, and you start tearing it apart so you can see how it works, so you can see what its component parts are, and all the way down to the very beginning. And it's a term that's very common in software development, where somebody can look at a programmer can look at an existing program and he can reverse engineer it. He can figure out the programming code that makes it work, and then he goes off and he does something similar. So I decided to do the same thing with a sale. So essentially what it is I started with what is the final product of a sale. What's the last step of a sale? And then I started working backwards from there, figuring that I'll be able to capture every step that's required in order to make a sale. So the final step I have here is obviously the customer buys the product. There's actually a step after that that I don't include. If you wanted to include it, it'd be step 9, which is the prospect becomes a client, actually owns the product. As salespeople, we know that until they own it and they're happy with it and they're using it, the sale really isn't totally complete because they could always return it. But that's taken for granted. Obviously, before they can own it, they have to buy it. So I started there. My next question was, well, in order for a prospect to buy a product, what has to happen right before that? Well, he has to want the product. It's pretty obvious. He has to have enough interest in the product in order to pay for it. And in my book, I talk about, well, how much interest does he have to have? And if you get my book and you go through it, you're going to see that the level of interest is only enough interest in order to buy. He doesn't have to have 100% checked off everything about the product and he's ecstatic about the product. All I want is that there's enough interest so that he'll buy the product. So great, he wants the product, now he buys the product, but how do I get him to that step? What has to happen right before he wants the product? The prospect has to be aware of the product and how it solves his or her problem. Now, no one's going to want a product, no one's going to want a service, no one's going to buy your idea unless they become aware of what your solution is and how it solves his or her particular problem. It could be problem, it could be a desire that they have or a goal they want to achieve. I'm just using the term problem here for the webinar, but it's inclusive of those concepts. So without them if I don't make them aware of how it solves their problem, it's not going to generate any interest, which won't give me an opportunity to then close the sale. So right before that, I asked what has to happen right before they become aware and how it solves his or her problem. Their attention needs to be directed to the product features or benefits. Well, that's obvious. That's your presentation. I need to be able to direct the attention of my prospect to those characteristics, those features, those items of the product or service that I know will solve the problem I've located that they have. And at the same time, I want to translate those features into benefits. The difference between features and benefits: features are the unique characteristics, the things about your product or service. The benefits are What does it mean to them? What's in it for them? What's the ultimate thing they're going to get out of it? And as a salesperson, you want to translate those features into benefits every moment you can and not leave it up to chance. The prospect may hear something. I'll give you an example. You're selling a car, and you say, this car has 500 horsepower. That's the feature. Well, what's the benefit? The benefit is you will experience neck-breaking speed or neck-breaking acceleration. In other words, you want to translate the feature into the benefit. That's what's going to make them aware of the product and how it's going to solve their problem. That's what's going to end up in generating enough interest so that they'll buy the product. All right, prior to that, before step 5, I asked the question, what has to happen just before that? Well, the prospect has to want the problem solved and wants to hear the solution. Now, by the way, all this I'm sure it makes common sense to you, and you're looking at it and you go, well, duh, this is what has to happen. However, you'll be surprised how many salespeople that I've run across and trained in the past that leave some of these steps out. This one in particular. Maybe they find the problem that the prospect has and immediately they jump right into their presentation, the salesperson does, without first finding out or first confirming that the prospect wants the problem solved and wants to hear your solution. Those are two agreements, minor agreements, that build toward the final agreement of them buying the product. And it's a very essential step. It's actually setting up the presentation, which we'll talk about a little bit later. All right, so right before that, what has to happen in order for them to want the problem solved and wants to hear the solution? Well, I have to find the problem. I got to find the problem that's unique to them. I need to find the goal or desire that they want fulfilled. Whatever it is, it's something that I know that my product service will solve, and I need to find that. If I don't find that, how do I know how to craft or customize my presentation? As we go further into this, I'm going to show you that there's 3 types of salespeople, and one of them is called a presenter. And a presenter focuses just on that, his presentation. He feels that if he knows everything about his product and he just says all the features about his product, that hopefully one of those features will align with and hit the problem that the prospect has, whether or not the presenter even found it. All right, but as a master closer, you want to find that problem, and we'll talk about that in a minute. All right, before finding the problem, you want to know if the prospect's qualified. Now, this step is really for you, for the closer. It's to find out from your point of view whether or not the prospect has a need for the product, has the wherewithal to purchase the product, and has the authority to make the decision. If you don't do that, and it's optional, it's your choice, you're just taking a risk of wasting your time, wasting the prospect's time, going all the way through steps 4 and 5, and maybe even step 6, and possibly step 7, and find out that they are not qualified. They don't have the money, they can't make the decision. In a lot of cases, they really don't have a need. So you want to find those things out as early on as possible. There's no set time when you have to do it. I put it as step 2, just so that you know you want to do it as early as possible. And it's something that you can blend in with the other steps, and it goes into detail on how to do that in my book. And of course, before that, the first step is your introduction or your contact of your prospect. And the purpose of the introduction is to essentially grab their attention and earn the right to start controlling the direction of the sale. And in my book, I go into lots of different examples of that. Of course, the introduction will vary based on, is the person calling into you? Is he walking into your place of business? Are you cold calling? Did they respond to an internet ad or some advertisement? So your introduction is adjusted according to how you first ran into the prospect. So right there, we have the 8-step roadmap. Now, when I did this, it became really apparent to me that I was missing a couple of very key steps. For instance, step 4, I wasn't really setting up the presentation, making sure he wants his problem solved and wants to hear the solution. My step 5 and step 6, which is really my presentation, I had the purpose incorrect, and that was causing some trouble. If I didn't find the correct problem or I didn't find any problem at all that they wanted solved, and I went into my presentation, I would lose their interest, and the sale wouldn't be made. So these are the 8 steps, and this is pretty universal. Now, what I would suggest to you is that you reverse engineer your own sale for your own unique product or service. And if it turns out these are the same 8 steps, that's fine. If not, you may have a step or 2 that's a little bit different, or an additional step that needs to take place. But this is how I found all the 8 steps. And what has that allowed me to do? It's allowed me to have a direction. I know exactly where I need to go at any time during the sale. And without this, I was kind of flying blind. Now, moving on, there's 3 types of salespeople. And these 3 types have a lot to do with their ability to work this roadmap. So let's go over those real quick. First one are order takers, and that's what I was when I first got into sales. I didn't know anything about closing a sale. I didn't know anything about the 8-step roadmap. I was basically an order taker. I was relying on the marketing and the advertising to generate enough interest so that I would then just take the order. And order takers are good in certain types of businesses that are designed to generate enough interest from the marketing, and all you have to do is take the order. I would venture to guess that most of us do not want order takers working for us, nor do we want to be order takers. All right, next is presenters, and as the name implies, these guys are great at their presentation. They will know everything there is to know, possibly to know about their product or service. They know every feature. They know the background of every feature. They know the history of the product. They can tell you everything about the product. You ask them a question, they'll be able to answer it. But they're not closers, they're presenters. So what they do is they are completely immersed in the presentation. It's the beginning of their process, it's the end of the process, everything to do with presentation. And they don't know how to use it as a tool to actually close sales. All right, and the last one are closers. Now closers, as the name implies, close sales. They can end the process and get a sale closed. These guys do not leave anything to chance. They know the 8-step roadmap inside and out. They know how to utilize each of the steps of the roadmap. They know they know how to use the presentation as a tool to generate buying opportunities or closing opportunities. They leave nothing to chance. They actually cause sales to occur. A presenter sometimes causes sales to occur through just the use of the presentation. An order taker never really causes a sale to occur. They're really the effect of it. All right, so these 3 types, they're determined by their ability and willingness to control their prospects' attention in a positive manner to persuade them to buy. This data here applies to the 8 steps of the 8-step roadmap. You are actually controlling the attention, you're controlling the conversation of the prospect through each step of the roadmap, eventually leading him up to the point where he has enough interest so that he'll buy the product. But it's your ability to control, it's your willingness and ability to control or direct the prospect's attention that will determine your success. And I have a scale here that shows where these guys would be located based on that ability. Order taker, no or little control, rarely causes sales to occur, a little higher up on the scale. You got the presenter. As I said earlier, they do cause sales to occur occasionally, but it's at random. And of course, then the closer systematically causes sales to occur. They are fully in control of each step of the roadmap. They know how to use it. They know how to use each tool to get a sale done. This is kind of a graphic description of the presenter when we start. As an analogy, if you were flying an airplane, the presenter knows how to take off. He knows how to stay airborne, but he doesn't know where the landing strip is. And eventually he or the prospect will run out of fuel and maybe even overshoot the landing strip. See, there's going to be times when a presenter happens to be saying the right thing, which happens to align with the problem that the prospect has, and the prospect suddenly gives some sort of signal that he has enough interest in order to buy. But being a presenter, the presenter doesn't spot that. He continues on with the presentation because he has an obligation, he feels, to tell everything about the product or service and really blow the mind of that prospect before he asks for the order. And you can see from the graphic description what can happen there. Of course, a closer goes from point A to point B. He uses the roadmap. He knows that if he strays from the roadmap, he knows exactly where he is during the process of the sale so he can get back onto it. And then he moves forward, always thinking of how to close the sale. So there are three things that a closer is always focused on. One is knowing how to create opportunities to close. If, as an example, I like to use the analogy, Michael Jordan, the greatest basketball player who ever lived. How did he become the greatest basketball player? Well, he scored a lot of points, but how did he do that? He created shooting opportunities. If you don't shoot the basket, if you don't make the basket, you get no points. If you don't shoot the ball, you don't have an opportunity to make the basket to make the points. But the difference, what separated Michael Jordan, made him a master closer versus everybody else or a lot of the other players, was his ability to create shooting opportunities where there were none or where others perceived there were none. He was able to, with a head fake or a move to the left or the right or a little juke or do something, physically throw the defender out of the way so the lane opens up or the view of the basket's there for a split second, and then he acted on it. He didn't see the opportunity and then pass the ball off, and he didn't create the opportunity and just continue dribbling and go along those lines. That would be something like the Harlem Globetrotters. I don't know if you guys are familiar with who they are, but it was a team that really would be classified as presenters. They put on a show. They used all their basketball skills and ball handling skills, and it was really terrifically entertaining, but they very rarely shot the ball, or they certainly didn't shoot the ball as often as they had opportunities to score the basket because that wasn't their purpose. Their purpose was to present and show their ball skills, and it was great. But they were bypassing opportunities or not creating opportunities. Well, in the NBA, that doesn't work. In the NBA, in basketball, you got to create opportunities where they may not exist, and you got to shoot the basket. Same thing in sales, where a presenter or an order taker may not see an opportunity or know even how to create an opportunity other than maybe using their presentation. A closer knows exactly how to set the prospect up, what steps to take to create the opportunity to close. And obviously, the more opportunities you can create, more chances you have to close. Your success increases to that degree. The other thing a closer needs to know is when to close. And I mentioned that briefly in the last graphic with the presenter flying past the landing strip because he doesn't even know what he's looking for. A closer knows exactly what he's looking for. He's looking for a closing opportunity. Once he has it, he knows to stop presenting and move to the close. And what is a closing opportunity? As I mentioned earlier, it's a moment in time, it's a signal that the prospect gives you that he has enough interest to buy. And again, the key word is enough interest to buy. So once you have that, you got to move to the close. And of course, that's the last step that the closer is concerned with, is knowing how to close. And you know, I've studied a lot of different, there's books out there and lectures out there, 50 ways to close and 100 ways to close and 10 ways to close. And the truth is they're really kind of gimmicky. They do work, but they work if you have the other 7 steps of the roadmap in. And what I found out early in my career, once I figured out the 8 steps and I figured out the purpose of each step of the roadmap, I didn't need 50 ways to close. I needed one closing sequence, and I ended up using it for nearly 5 to 10 years when I was in sales for myself, and then I adapted it to each of the sales companies I created. I didn't want salespeople having to rely on cutesy, gimmicky closing phrases. I wanted the close to be a natural end to having done the first seven steps correctly. All right, so I'm starting to run out of time here, but in my book, I have not only the 8-step roadmap as I laid it out there, but I have each step explained in detail. It's really important that you understand the purpose of each step, which I lay out, or the definition of each step, and exactly how to achieve the step. There's actually, in the 8 steps that I showed you earlier, there's a step or another 8 steps that align with what's happening with the prospect, the 8 steps that a salesperson or a closer has to do to get the prospect through each of those steps. I explain those in detail, and in addition to that, I give some scripted wording examples. Of course, you need to modify them to apply to what you're selling or what your service or product is. And one other point, if you understand the purpose of the step, if you understand exactly what you're doing on that step, you can create your own phrases, your own techniques, if you understand the underlying fundamentals. I also include in the book exercises to master each step at the end of each chapter. Other things in there I mentioned about introductions. I have samples of introductions and how to craft those best for your particular business, service, or a product. How to leave messages that you can get callbacks, getting receptionists to become allies and actually help you so you can get to the decision maker. I have several ways of how do you follow up on a call after you've done your first part of your presentation and you need to have a follow-up call. So I have the best ways to start a callback. One last piece of knowledge I want to leave with you, which is really important, is how to use your presentation to create opportunities to close. I will leave you with this, that I have asked 3,000 salespeople over the last 20 years, what is the purpose of the presentation? And virtually 9 out of 10 of them could not give me the actual purpose. And if you don't know the actual purpose, to that degree, you're going to shorten your success and even stumble. So in my book, I explain exactly what is the purpose of the presentation and then how to use that in order to get the guy all the way through the sales process. I also have some information on how to negotiate price, and I know a lot of you have interest in how to handle objections. I have three different formulas. The first 2 are very, very, very simple that handle probably 50% of the things you run into, so you don't spend a lot of time. The third one I call the master closer objection, or objection formula, which is really a formula that allows you to turn any objection into another closing opportunity, so that you'll never fear ever hearing an objection again. In fact, you will be anxiously awaiting them so that you can turn them to your advantage. In addition to that, there's information on lead management. I have a chapter on how to debug poor performance if your sales statistics have declined, exactly how. There's 2 ways to debug it. I go into that. I also have a checklist of the ideal personality of a closer. You can actually assess yourself on that checklist, and on a scale of 1 to 10, and anything that's not a 10, you can work out a solution to raise it to that level. And there's a lot more. So I'm going to close with letting you know where my book's available. It's on Amazon.com and also at Barnes & Noble. I can tell you this, it costs less than a sandwich and is a lot more valuable. I hope you got a lot out of what I mentioned. I didn't have a lot of time here to go into a lot of details. I wanted to give you more of the fundamental overview so that going forward, no matter what you do in sales, that you'll have a greater understanding. Alrighty, hope everybody enjoyed it, and thanks for your time.